The morning fog hung thick over the Ardennes forest, like a burial shroud, so dense that Private First Class James Hartley could barely see 10 feet beyond the sandbags that formed his machine gun position. It was December 16th, 1944, and the cold had settled into his bones with a kind of permanence that made him wonder if he would ever feel warm again. He had been awake for 36 hours, rotating watch with the other men in his platoon, listening to the silence of the forest and trying not to think about how exposed they were, how thin their line stretched across this forgotten corner of Belgium. James was 22 years old, though he felt decades older than the farm boy who had left Iowa 14 months earlier. The war had carved away everything soft in him, leaving behind something harder and more essential, something that knew how to function on no sleep and cold rations, how to dig a foxhole in frozen ground, how to watch a friend die and keep moving forward because stopping meant joining him. He had learned these lessons in the bocage country of Normandy, in the brutal house-to-house fighting through French villages whose names he could no longer remember, and he carried them with him now like scars that had healed over but never really faded. His position was a small machine gun nest on the eastern edge of a crossroads, one of dozens scattered along the American line facing the German border. The assignment was routine, almost boring in its predictability. Hold the position, watch for enemy activity, maintain communication with the command post 200 yards behind the line. The war had supposedly stalled here, both sides exhausted and waiting for spring, and their sector had been quiet for weeks. So quiet that some of the men had started to relax, to talk about Christmas packages from home and whether they might get leave to Paris. James never relaxed. Something in him, some instinct honed by too many close calls and too many men who had died because they let their guard down, kept him vigilant even when logic said there was nothing to be vigilant about. He cleaned his weapon obsessively, checked his ammunition supply twice a day, and scanned the tree line with the kind of attention that made the other men joke that he was afraid of squirrels. The joke stopped being funny at 0530 hours, when the German artillery opened up with a barrage so massive it seemed like the earth itself was tearing apart. James hit the bottom of his foxhole as shells screamed overhead and detonated across the American positions, geysers of frozen earth and shrapnel rising into the fog. The sound was beyond comprehension, a physical force that crushed thought and replaced it with pure animal survival instinct. He curled into himself, hands over his helmet, and counted seconds between impacts because it was the only way to hold onto sanity when the world was ending around him. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse, broken only by screams from wounded men and the crackle of fires burning in what remained of the command post. James lifted his head slowly, his ears ringing so badly he could barely hear, and saw that his position had survived mostly intact. The sandbags were torn and scattered, his fighting hole partially collapsed, but his machine gun was undamaged and his ammunition boxes were still secure. He looked back toward the command post and saw only smoke and debris. The radio was gone, the officers were gone, and through the thinning fog, he could see German infantry advancing in massive waves. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving through the shattered American positions like water flowing around stones. This wasn't a probe or a limited attack. This was an offensive on a scale he had never seen. A concentrated thrust designed to break through the American line and drive deep into Allied territory. James watched them come, and something very cold and very clear settled over him. He understood in that moment that he was going to die today. The realization came without panic or despair, just a simple acceptance of fact. The question was not whether he would survive, but what he would do with the time he had left. His position commanded the crossroads, a junction where two dirt roads met before continuing east into American territory. If the Germans took this crossroads, they would have a clear route to the supply depots and field hospitals in the rear areas. He could see their tactical intent in the way they moved, infantry supported by armor, all focused on pushing through and exploiting the breakthrough. They would reach the crossroads in minutes unless something stopped them. James made a decision that felt both rational and insane. He would hold this position for as long as possible, delay the German advance, buy time for survivors to reorganize or evacuate, or at least understand what was happening. It was a futile gesture, one man against an army, but futility had stopped mattering the moment the barrage ended and revealed the scale of what they were facing. All that mattered now was doing what needed to be done, for as long as he could do it. He pulled his machine gun back into position, cleared the debris from his firing lane, and arranged his ammunition boxes within easy reach. He had 8 boxes, 2,000 rounds, enough to make a difference if he used them well. He checked his rifle, his grenades, his canteen. He thought briefly about his family back in Iowa, about his mother who wrote him letters every week, about his younger sister who had cried when he left, about the girl he had promised to marry when the war ended. He let himself hold those images for exactly 5 seconds, then pushed them away and focused on the tree line where the German infantry was emerging. The first squad appeared at 300 yards, moving cautiously through the fog, weapons ready, advancing in the practiced manner of experienced soldiers who had fought across half of Europe. James let them close the distance to 100 yards, watching them through his sights, waiting for the moment when the maximum number of them would be exposed in his kill zone. His heart was steady, his breathing controlled, his hands completely still on the weapon. This was what all the training had been for, all the endless drills and mock battles and hours on the range. This moment, when everything reduced to sight picture and trigger control and the cold mathematics of effective fire. He opened up at 75 yards, the machine gun roaring to life, tracer rounds cutting through the fog in deadly streams. The leading German soldiers went down immediately, surprised by fire coming from a position they thought had been destroyed in the barrage. The survivors scattered, diving for cover, returning fire that cracked over James's head and thudded into the sandbags. He traversed the gun smoothly, methodically, working over the entire kill zone, not trying for individual targets but laying down a field of fire that nothing could cross. The first squad fell back, leaving their dead and wounded in the road. James used the lull to reload, his movements automatic, muscle memory taking over, while his mind stayed focused on the tree line. He knew they would come again, in greater numbers, with more firepower. He knew he was announcing his position to every German soldier within earshot. He knew he had just ensured that he would become the primary target for whatever they threw at him next. The second assault came 10 minutes later, 2 squads advancing with covering fire from machine guns positioned in the tree line. James took fire from 3 directions at once, bullets tearing through the sandbags, forcing him to stay low, limiting his ability to return effective fire. But the crossroads was still the objective, and the Germans still had to cross his kill zone to reach it. He waited until they committed to the advance, then rose and fired in controlled bursts, picking his targets, making every round count. He hit the lead soldier, then the one behind him, then shifted to the squad coming from the left flank. His gun was hot now, the barrel glowing, brass casings piling up around his feet. He could feel the heat through his gloves, could smell the gun oil burning, could taste metal and smoke. The Germans were shooting back with everything they had, a sustained volume of fire that would have been overwhelming if he had allowed himself to think about it. Instead, he focused on fundamentals: breathe, aim, fire, move, reload. The second assault broke and fell back, leaving more bodies in the road. James was bleeding now. Shrapnel from a near miss had torn into his shoulder, but the wound was superficial, and his arm still worked. He reloaded again, counted his remaining ammunition, and accepted that he had maybe 3 more boxes, 1,500 rounds, enough for perhaps 2 more defensive stands, before he was out and reduced to his rifle. The Germans pulled back out of sight, and James used the break to improve his position. He dragged sandbags from a destroyed fighting hole nearby, reinforcing his cover, creating better firing angles. He found a canteen on a dead American soldier and drank deeply, the water so cold it hurt his teeth. He reloaded all his empty magazines, organized his grenades, and tried not to look at the bodies of his platoon scattered across the position. He thought about Sergeant Martinez, who had been planning to open a restaurant in San Antonio after the war. About Corporal Davis, who carried a photograph of his newborn son and showed it to anyone who would look. About Private Wilson, barely 18, who had been terrified of combat, but had done his job anyway, because that was what you did. They were all gone now, vaporized in the barrage or cut down in the initial assault. And James was alone, not because he was special or lucky, but because his position happened to survive when theirs did not. The third assault came with armor support. 2 Panzer IV tanks rolling forward, with infantry using them as cover. James felt his stomach drop when he saw the tanks. His machine gun was useless against armor, and he had no anti-tank weapons, no bazookas, nothing that could stop 70 tons of steel and high explosive. The tanks would simply drive up to his position and destroy it at point-blank range, and there was nothing he could do except die well. But the tanks had to navigate the debris field created by the artillery barrage, and the roads were cratered and blocked with destroyed vehicles. They moved slowly, carefully, trying to find a path that wouldn't throw a track or expose their thinner side armor. And while they maneuvered, they were vulnerable in ways their commanders didn't anticipate. James grabbed his rifle and the white phosphorus grenades he had scavenged from the destroyed positions. White phosphorus wasn't designed for anti-tank work, but it burned at over 5,000 degrees and created smoke that could blind a tank's vision slits. He waited until the lead tank was 50 yards away, its commander visible in the open turret hatch, then threw the grenade with every ounce of strength he had. The grenade hit the tank's engine deck and detonated, white phosphorus spraying across the rear armor and into the engine compartment. The tank lurched to a stop, white smoke pouring from the vents, the crew bailing out as the interior filled with toxic fumes. The second tank, seeing its companion disabled, fired its main gun at James's position, the shell exploding close enough to bury him in dirt and debris and leave his ears bleeding. He came up firing his machine gun at the infantry following the tanks, catching them exposed and bunched up, cutting through them with sustained fire that was born more of rage than tactics. The German soldiers scattered, the second tank reversed behind cover, and for a moment, the battlefield went quiet, except for the screams of wounded men and the crackle of the burning tank. James slumped against the sandbags, his body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, blood running down his face from a cut he didn't remember receiving. He had 3 ammunition boxes left, maybe 1,000 rounds, and the Germans would be calling in artillery or mortars to eliminate him before they tried another assault. He had bought perhaps 30 minutes, maybe an hour if he was lucky, and in the grand scheme of the battle that was unfolding across the entire Ardennes, it was nothing. A footnote, barely worth mentioning. But in that hour, wounded American soldiers were stumbling back toward the rear lines. In that hour, a field hospital was being evacuated, patients loaded onto trucks and moved to safety. In that hour, a battalion commander was organizing a defensive line 2 miles back, positioning his forces to contain the German breakthrough. James didn't know any of this, had no way of knowing it, but he understood at a fundamental level that time was the most valuable resource in war, and he was spending his life to purchase it. The artillery came at hour 4, German mortars walking across the position, each round closer than the last, methodically destroying everything in the impact zone. James huddled in his fighting hole, arms wrapped around his machine gun, praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The shells came closer, closer, and then one landed directly in his position, the explosion lifting him off the ground and slamming him against the frozen earth with force that drove the air from his lungs. He woke to silence and darkness, buried under sandbags and debris, unable to move his legs, tasting blood and dirt. For a moment he thought he was dead, that this was what death felt like, until pain arrived like a freight train and informed him that he was very much alive and very badly hurt. He couldn't feel his left leg at all, and his right leg was pinned under something heavy. His ribs were broken, every breath a knife in his chest. His machine gun was gone, buried somewhere in the collapsed position. He should have stayed down, should have let unconsciousness take him. should have accepted that he had done all he could and rest was earned. But through the ringing in his ears he heard voices speaking German, heard boots crunching on frozen ground, heard the metallic click of weapons being readied. They were clearing the position, making sure the American defender was truly dead before they moved the advance forward. James found his rifle in the debris. The wood stock cracked, but the action still functional. He had 1 magazine, 8 rounds, and hands that barely had the strength to work the bolt. He pulled himself up using his arms, dragging his useless legs behind him, positioning himself against what remained of the sandbags. The German soldiers appeared through the smoke. 3 of them, young men in Feldgrau uniforms, weapons raised, advancing cautiously toward what they assumed was a corpse. He shot the first one center mass, worked the bolt, shot the second one as he turned toward the sound. The third soldier dove for cover and returned fire, bullets snapping past James's head. James fired again, missed, fired again, and saw the German soldier fall. Then his rifle was empty, and he had no strength left to reload. No strength for anything except slumping back against the sandbags and watching the sky lighten as the fog burned away. He thought about Iowa, about cornfields stretching to the horizon, about the smell of his mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, about the creek where he used to fish with his father. He thought about the girl he loved, about the letter he had written her but never sent, about all the ordinary days he would never see. He thought about his platoon, about how he would be joining them soon, about whether they would understand that he had tried, that he had held as long as he could. The next voices he heard were American, rough and urgent, hands lifting debris, a medic's face appearing above him, young and scared, but determined. Someone was saying his name, asking if he could hear them, and James tried to answer but his voice wouldn't work. They were pulling him free, carrying him, and the pain was so intense he finally surrendered to it and let the darkness take him. He woke in a field hospital 3 days later, his left leg gone below the knee, his body held together with bandages and morphine, and the stubborn insistence that he was not done living yet. A colonel came to see him, a man with tired eyes and the weight of command visible in every line of his face. The colonel sat beside his bed and told him that his defense of the crossroads had delayed an entire German regiment for 6 hours, that those 6 hours had allowed the American forces to stabilize their line and prevent a catastrophic breakthrough, that his actions had saved hundreds of lives and possibly altered the outcome of the battle. James listened and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make sense to someone who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the clarity that came from accepting death and choosing action over surrender. The colonel pinned a medal to his hospital gown, shook his remaining hand gently, and left him alone with his thoughts and his memories and the phantom pain of a leg that was no longer there. Years later, when military historians studied the Battle of the Bulge, they would debate the defense of that unnamed crossroads, arguing about whether it was truly as significant as the after-action reports claimed, whether one man could have made that much difference, whether the story had been embellished in the retelling. They would examine the evidence, interview survivors, and ultimately conclude that the truth was unknowable, lost to the fog of war and the chaos of that terrible December. But James knew the truth, carried it with him through decades of ordinary life, through marriage and children and grandchildren, through quiet nights when the phantom leg ached and the memories returned with perfect clarity. The truth was that impossible defenses happened not because men were superhuman, but because they were deeply human. Because when everything else was stripped away, they chose to stand rather than run, to fight rather than surrender, to spend their lives purchasing time for others to live. The truth was that on a frozen morning in Belgium, a farm boy from Iowa had looked at overwhelming odds and decided they didn't matter as much as doing what needed to be done. The truth was that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that heroism was often indistinguishable from stubbornness, and that the impossible became possible the moment someone refused to accept that it wasn't. James Hartley lived to be 87 years old, long enough to see the world change in ways he could never have imagined, long enough to watch his grandchildren grow up in a peace his generation had paid for in blood and sacrifice. He rarely spoke about the war, rarely mentioned the crossroads or the medal that gathered dust in a drawer he never opened. But sometimes, on December mornings when the fog hung thick and the cold settled deep, he would stand at his window and remember the weight of the machine gun in his hands, the faces of the men who had died beside him, and the strange peace that had come from knowing exactly who he was and what he was willing to give when everything else fell away and only the essential remained.